It was a simple school field trip until the entire class disappeared. The first sign was the silence. Not the gentle, after-hours quiet of a school hallway, but a profound, swallowing emptiness that felt like a tear in the fabric of the world. It was 3:47 p.m. The yellow bus, designated number 7, should have rumbled into the parking lot of Northwood Elementary precisely 17 minutes ago. It hatzed Sarah Jenkins, a mother whose life was a meticulously curated schedule of PTA meetings and gluten-free bake sales, felt the first prickle of unease. Her son, Leo, a boy with a galaxy of freckles and a gap-toothed smile, was on that bus. He'd been vibrating with excitement for weeks about the annual 4th grade trip to the Blackwood National Forest, a sprawling expanse of ancient redwoods and whispering pines just an hour outside their manicured suburban town. She checked her phone. No texts, no calls. The parents' group chat, usually a frantic buzz of emojis and last-minute reminders, was unnervingly still. She stood at the edge of the school's manicured lawn, the California sun warming her shoulders, but a chill was creeping up her spine. Other parents were starting to gather, their faces a mixture of impatience and forced nonchalance. A few joked about the driver, old Mr. Abernathy, probably taking a scenic detour. But the jokes were brittle, cracking under the weight of the unspoken question that hung in the air like exhaust fumes. Where are they? The school principal, a man named Mr. Thompson, whose smile never quite reached his eyes, emerged from the main office. He walked with a forced calmness that set every nerve in Sarah's body on edge. He was holding a phone to his ear, his knuckles white. "We're just trying to get a signal," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful. "You know how it is up in those woods. Spotty service." But Sarah had been to Blackwood Forest. She'd hiked there with her husband Mark just last year. There were dead zones, yes, but not everywhere, not for this long. An hour and 17 minutes of radio silence wasn't spotty service. It was a void. The unease began to curdle into something sharper, something acidic. A father in a wrinkled business suit, his tie loosened, stepped forward. "What about the teacher? Miss Albright, can't you reach her?" "We're trying," Thompson repeated, the smile now a grimace. "We're trying, everyone. Mr. Abernathy, the driver, Miss Albright, the 2 parent chaperones." The mention of the chaperones sent another jolt through the crowd. 2 other mothers, Amelia and Jessica, were on that bus. Their husbands were now standing side by side, a silent, grim-faced alliance. The sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, a cruel, beautiful backdrop to the unfolding horror. The minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The forced smiles had long since vanished, replaced by pale, taut masks of fear. Whispers turned into frantic, choked questions. People were pacing, calling relatives, their voices cracking. Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Mark. He'd left work early, his face etched with the same dread she felt churning in her stomach. He wrapped his arms around her, but the comfort couldn't penetrate the cold terror that had taken root in her bones. "They're just late," he murmured into her hair, but it was a prayer, not a statement. It was then that the first police car arrived. It didn't use its siren, but the flashing red and blue lights sliced through the twilight, illuminating the faces of the parents in stark, terrifying flashes. The jig was up. This was no longer a delay. This was an incident. A sheriff's deputy, a woman with a weary, compassionate face, got out of the car. She spoke in low tones to Mr. Thompson, who nodded, his face ashen. The principal then turned to the crowd of parents, his composure finally shattering. We have to ask you all to please go home," he stammered, his voice trembling. "The sheriff's department is handling this now. They've dispatched a search team to the park." A collective gasp, a chorus of strangled cries, rippled through the parents. "Go home," a woman shrieked, her voice hysterical. "Our children are out there. We're not going anywhere." The deputy stepped forward. "Ma'am, we understand. But we need this area clear. We'll set up a command post here at the school. We promise we will keep you updated. Please, for your children's sake, Let us do our jobs. The plea, meant to be reassuring, was anything but. For your children's sake, the words implied a danger so profound, so immediate, that the presence of anxious parents was a hindrance to their rescue. The crowd didn't disperse. They simply coalesced, a tight, trembling knot of shared terror. They were a tribe now, bound by the same primal fear. The night grew darker, colder. The school, usually a place of laughter and learning, became a vigil sight, its fluorescent lights casting a sickly yellow glow on the faces of the waiting. News vans began to arrive. Their satellite dishes aimed at the sky like metallic vultures. Reporters with microphones and sympathetic expressions tried to coax soundbites from the grieving. But the parents were a wall of silent shock. Sarah sat on the cold concrete steps, Mark's arm a leaden weight around her. She couldn't cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside, a glacier of unspeakable dread. She kept seeing Leo's face, his eyes bright with excitement as he'd boarded the bus that morning. He'd turned and waved, his hand small and confident. "Bye, Mum, I'll bring you back a pinnacle." A pinnacle, such a small, simple promise. Now, it felt like a relic from another lifetime. The hours bled into one another. Coffee was passed around in paper cups, but no one drank it. Blankets were offered, but no one felt the cold. They were suspended in a state of pure, undiluted waiting. Every flicker of a headlight, every crackle of a police radio, sent a surge of adrenaline through the crowd. A desperate hope that was instantly extinguished. Around 2 a.m. A detective with tired eyes and a grin set to his jaw addressed the media. And, by extension, the parents huddled around a TV in the school library. At approximately 6:45 p.m., he began, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. A park ranger on a routine patrol discovered the school bus, number 7, on an access road in the northern sector of Blackwood National Forest. The bus was empty. A low moan went through the library. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs, a silent scream trapped in her chest. The detective continued, his words precise, clinical, each one a hammer blow. The engine was running. The doors were open. The children's belongings, backpacks, lunchboxes, jackets were still on the seats. There was no sign of a struggle. No sign of a crash. It was as if they had simply vanished. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. 22 children, 1 teacher, and 3 adults. All gone? We have found no footprints, no tracks, no evidence of any kind to suggest where they might have gone. We are treating this as a mass abduction. The word hung in the air, obscene and monstrous. Abduction. It was a word from nightmares, from sensational news reports about other people, other families. It wasn't a word that belonged in their quiet, safe town. But the detective wasn't finished. He held up a clear plastic bag. Inside was a single object, a child's drawing on a piece of crumpled construction paper. This was found on the driver's seat, he said. It's the only thing that seems out of place. The camera zoomed in. The drawing was crude, rendered in thick, black crayon. It depicted a tall, impossibly thin figure with long, spindly limbs and a perfectly round, featureless face. The figure was standing among the trees, and all around it. Small stick figures, the children were holding hands, their faces blank ovals of terror. At the bottom of the page, in a child's messy scrawl, were 3 words. The Whispering Man, Sarah's. Blood ran cold. She knew that drawing. Leo had been scribbling it for weeks, a recurring nightmare he couldn't explain. He'd told her about the Whispering Man, a tall man who walked in the woods and promised secrets to children who followed him. She'd dismissed it as a child's fantasy, a boogeyman born of an overactive imagination. Now, that fantasy was a piece of evidence in a national news story. Her son's nightmare had swallowed him whole. The detective's face was grim. We don't know what this means. We don't know who this Whispering Man is, but I can promise you this. We will not rest until we find your children. Press conference ended. The library was silent, save for the sound of muffled sobs. Sarah felt a strange, terrifying calm settle over her. The not knowing had been a form of torture, a slow, agonizing burn. Now, there was a shape to their fear, a name to their monster, the Whispering Man. She looked at Mark, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. She saw her own terror reflected in his eyes. Their world had been upended, their future erased. There was only one thought in her mind, a single, burning purpose. Find Leo. Whatever it took. Whoever she had to become, she stood up, her legs shaky but determined. The other parents were looking at her, their eyes filled with a desperate, unspoken question. They needed a leader, a voice for their collective anguish. In that moment, the PTA mum, the baker of gluten-free cookies, died. In her place stood a warrior, a mother whose love had been forged into a weapon. "We're not just going to wait," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the despair. "Going to find them. We're going to bring our children home." The sun was rising, casting long, eerie shadows across the empty school parking lot. It was the dawn of a new day, a day that held no promise, only the cold, hard reality of their loss. The search for the lost children of Northwood had begun, and for Sarah, the fight for her son's life was a war she was prepared to win or die trying. The cliffhanger wasn't a question of if they would be found, but what would be left of them, and of the parents who waited, when the truth, finally, emerged from the dark, silent woods. The silence of the forest had become a scream, and it was a scream that would echo across the nation, a haunting prelude to a story of secrets, lies, and the terrifying darkness that can hide in plain sight. The initial shockwave of the disappearance gave way to the grim, methodical machinery of a major investigation. The school became a fortress of law enforcement and media, a surreal landscape of satellite trucks, police tape, and grief counselors. Sarah, however, found no solace in the official channels. The daily press briefings were a litany of known information. "We're exploring all possibilities. The investigation is ongoing. We have no new leads at this time." It was a bureaucratic stonewall that felt like a betrayal. Her home, once a sanctuary of domestic bliss, was now a war room. Maps of Blackwood Forest covered the dining room table, marked with colored pins and frantic annotations. She and Mark, along with a handful of the most determined parents, had formed their own ad hoc investigation team. They interviewed anyone who had even a passing connection to the field trip, cross-referencing names, timelines, and scraps of conversation. They were drowning in data, but no closer to an answer. It was during one of these late-night sessions, fueled by stale coffee and raw desperation, that the first piece of the puzzle fell into place. It came from an unlikely source, a quiet, withdrawn boy named Ethan, who had been sick on the day of the trip. He was Leo's best friend. Sarah had gone to his house, hoping to find some clue in Leo's recent conversations, some hint of what might have been on his mind. Ethan's mother, a frail, nervous woman, ushered her into a living room that smelled of disinfectant and anxiety. Ethan sat on the couch, his knees drawn up to his chest, his eyes wide and haunted. "Want to go?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "Leo, he told me he was scared." Sarah's heart clenched. "Scared of what, honey? The woods?" Ethan shook his head, his dark hair falling into his eyes. "No, he loved the woods. We used to pretend we were explorers there all the time." He paused, swallowing hard. He was scared of the new teacher. The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. "The new teacher? You mean Ms. Albright?" "No," Ethan said, his gaze dropping to the floor. "The other one, the one who was helping her." Sarah frowned. There was no other teacher. It was just Ms. Albright and the 3 parent chaperones. "There was," Ethan insisted, his voice gaining a sliver of conviction. "He started a few weeks ago. A volunteer, Mr. Anderson. He was. Weird. Weird, how?" Sarah pressed, leaning forward, her every instinct on high alert. "He was always watching us," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "When we were on the playground, he'd just stand by the fence. He never smiled, and he smelled like the ground, like dirt and old leaves." A chill snaked down Sarah's spine. Did he ever talk to you? To Leo? Ethan nodded slowly. He told us stories. About the forest. About a man who lived there. A man who could grant wishes, but only if you were brave enough to follow him into the deep woods. He called him the Whispering Man. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The drawing, the nightmare. It wasn't a fantasy. It was a story, planted in her son's mind by a stranger. Why didn't you tell anyone, Ethan? She asked, her voice gentle but firm. Why didn't Leo tell me? Ethan's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Anderson said it was a secret, a special secret for the brave kids. He said the grown-ups wouldn't understand. He said if we told, the Whispering Man would be angry. Sarah's mind was racing, connecting dots that had been invisible just moments before. A volunteer teacher, a man no one seemed to know about. A man who had groomed the children with a terrifying fairy tale. She thanked Ethan and his mother. Her mind a whirlwind of new, horrifying possibilities. Back in her car, her hands trembled as she dialed the lead detective's number. Detective Harding was a man who operated on facts and evidence, and he was initially skeptical. A secret teacher, Mrs. Jenkins. We have the school's complete staff and volunteer records. There's no Mr. Anderson. He exists, Sarah insisted, her voice tight with urgency. Leo's best friend just told me he was there. He was poisoning their minds with this Whispering Man story. Harding sighed, a sound of weary patience. We'll look into it. But it's likely just a child's imagination, a way of coping with the trauma. It's not imagination. Sarah's voice rose, sharp and raw. This man is the key. Find him, and you'll find our children. Frustrated and dismissed, Sarah took matters into her own hands. She went to the school, armed with a photograph of Leo's class from the beginning of the year. She showed it to every teacher, every janitor, every administrative assistant. No one recognized the name Mr. Anderson. No one remembered a new volunteer, defeated. She was about to leave when she ran into Maria, one of the cafeteria ladies. Maria was a kind, grandmotherly woman who always slipped Leo an extra cookie. Sarah showed her the photo, her hope dwindling. Maria squinted at the picture, her brow furrowed. No, Mr. Anderson, she said, shaking her head. Then she paused, her eyes widening slightly. Wait, there was a man, a new janitor, started a month or so ago. Quiet man kept to himself. What was his name? Sarah asked, her heart pounding. I don't know his name, Maria said, but I remember him. Tall, thin, always wore a dark green jacket, and he had a strange smell, like damp earth. The description matched Ethan's, a janitor, not a teacher. A man who could move through the school unnoticed. A ghost in the hallways, watching, listening. Where is he now? Sarah demanded. Maria shrugged. He stopped showing up. About a week ago, the day before the field trip, it was a bombshell. A janitor, a man with access to the entire school, a man who fit the description of the mysterious Mr. Anderson, had vanished the day before the children disappeared. Sarah raced back to her car, her mind on fire. She called Detective Harding, her voice shaking with a mixture of terror and vindication. His name isn't Anderson. He's a janitor. A new janitor who disappeared the day before the trip. You have to find him. This time, Harding listened. The new information was a concrete lead, a thread to pull in a case that had been a tangled, impenetrable knot. The investigation pivoted, a massive lumbering machine turning its focus on a single shadowy figure. They found his name in the temp agency records. Thomas Miller, a man with no family, no friends, no social media presence. A ghost. His last known address was a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of town. Sarah insisted on going with the police. She needed to see for herself, to breathe the air the monster had breathed. The apartment was a scene of chilling emptiness. The bed was neatly made. The kitchen was spotless. There were no photographs, no personal belongings, no trace of a life. Lived it was as if he had never been there at all. But in the back of a closet, tucked away in a dusty shoebox, they found it. A single, faded photograph. It was a picture of a young boy, no older than 10, with a sad, haunted expression. was standing in front of an old, dilapidated cabin, the kind you might find deep in the woods. And behind him, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees, was a tall, thin man in a dark suit. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, were 2 words, Blackwood, 1986. The detective's face was grim as he looked at the photo. "We need to find out who this boy is." The search for the boy in the photograph led them to the town's archives, to dusty records of old newspapers and forgotten tragedies. And there, in a yellowed article from the local paper, dated October 31st, 1986, they found the story. A young boy named Thomas Miller had gone missing from his home on the edge of the Blackwood National Forest. He had been out trick-or-treating and had never returned. The town had searched for weeks, but no trace of him was ever found. He had simply vanished. The boy in the photograph, the boy who had disappeared without a trace 30 years ago, was the same man who had been working as a janitor at her son's school. Thomas Miller, the man they were hunting, was a ghost, a victim who had returned as a monster. The revelation sent a new wave of terror through Sarah. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was something deeper, something rooted in a long-forgotten past. Thomas Miller hadn't just taken their children. He had taken them back to the place where he had been lost, to the dark heart of the forest that had swallowed him whole. The nature of the antagonist was now terrifyingly clear. He wasn't just a kidnapper, he was a phantom, a man driven by a trauma so profound it had twisted him into a mirror image of his own personal horror. He was recreating his own disappearance, casting their children in the role he had been forced to play. And the hidden witness was no longer just a scared little boy. It was the entire town, a community that had allowed a child to vanish, that had forgotten his name and his story. The guilt was collective, a shared secret that had festered for decades. Sarah looked at the grainy photograph of the young, sad-faced boy, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than hatred for the man who had taken her son. It was a sliver of pity, a terrifying empathy for the monster they were hunting. He was not just their enemy. He was Blackwood's forgotten child, its first victim, and his return was a reckoning. The forest had a long memory, and it was finally time to pay its debts. The search for the children was now a search for a ghost, a journey into a past that was not dead, but merely sleeping, waiting to claim a new generation. The revelation that Thomas Miller, the janitor, was the boy who had vanished from Blackwood 30 years prior, sent the investigation into a frantic, desperate overdrive. The story broke, and the media descended on the small town with renewed ferocity. The narrative had shifted from a tragic abduction to a gothic horror story, a tale of a vengeful ghost returning to his old haunting grounds. For Sarah, the new information was a double-edged sword. It gave them a motive, a twisted logic to the madness, but it also plunged them into a deeper, more terrifying unknown. Miller wasn't just a criminal. He was a force of nature, a man shaped by the very woods that now held their children captive. The escalating conflict was no longer just a battle against a faceless kidnapper. It was a war against the past, against the town's own buried secrets. The parents, once united in their grief, began to fracture under the strain. Accusations flew. Why wasn't he vetted properly? Who hired a man with no background? The school board, the temp agency, the police department, they all became targets of the parents' rage and fear. Mr. Thompson, the principal, became a pariah. He was hounded by reporters, vilified on social media. His forced smiles and empty reassurances were now seen as signs of incompetence, or worse, a cover-up. He aged a decade in a matter of days, his face a permanent mask of exhaustion and despair. Sarah, however, had no time for blame. Her focus was singular, obsessive: understand Thomas Miller. She spent her days in the town library, poring over old maps and newspaper archives, trying to piece together the life of the boy who had become a monster. She learned that his family had been outsiders, a reclusive couple who had lived in a small cabin on the edge of the forest. They had left town shortly after their son's disappearance, leaving behind a house full of unanswered questions. Her nights were spent with the other parents in the war room, their hope dwindling with each passing day. The search parties, now numbering in the hundreds, combed every inch of Blackwood Forest, but found nothing. It was as if the children, and their captor, had been swallowed by the earth. The antagonist, Thomas Miller, remained a ghost, but his presence was felt everywhere. He was a phantom who haunted their every waking moment. The drawing of the Whispering Man was now a national symbol of terror, a meme that spread like wildfire across the internet. It appeared on t-shirts, on protest signs, in 1,000 different iterations of a shared nightmare. The cruelty of the situation was relentless. Every day, a new heartbreaking detail would emerge. A child's favorite toy found on a hiking trail, miles from where the bus was discovered. A single, muddy sneaker, pulled from the river, that snaked through the forest. Each clue was a fresh twist of the knife, a reminder of what they had lost. The victim, in this escalating drama, was not just one person, but an entire community. The children were the primary casualties, but their absence had created a ripple effect of pain and suffering that touched everyone. Marriages strained under the pressure. Friendships broke. The town of Northwood, once a symbol of suburban tranquility, was now a place of suspicion and paranoia. The hidden witness, the town itself, was forced to confront its own complicity. The older residents, the ones who remembered the Miller boys' disappearance, were now sought out by reporters and detectives. Their memories dredged for any detail that might shed light on the current tragedy. They spoke of a strange, withdrawn boy, a family that kept to themselves. They spoke of rumors, of whispers of a strange man who was seen in the woods around the time the boy vanished. But it was all hearsay, the faded memories of a long-forgotten tragedy. The sense of betrayal was palpable. The parents felt betrayed, by the school, by the police, by the very idea of safety they had taken for granted. Sarah felt betrayed by her own instincts. How could she not have known? How could she have missed the signs? The guilt was a constant gnawing presence. The tension reached a breaking point a week into the investigation. A local news station, in a desperate bid for ratings, aired a sensationalized special report on the case. They painted Thomas Miller as a diabolical mastermind, a vengeful spirit who had returned to punish the town that had forgotten him. They interviewed so-called experts, a psychic who claimed to be in communication with the lost children, a profiler who spun wild theories about satanic rituals and occult ceremonies. The report was a cruel, exploitative piece of journalism, but it had a devastating effect. It fanned the flames of hysteria, turning the town into a tinderbox of fear and suspicion. People started seeing the Whispering Man everywhere, in the shadows of the trees, in the face of a stranger. The line between reality and nightmare blurred. For Sarah, the report was the final straw. She had been playing by the rules, cooperating with the police, trying to maintain a semblance of civility in the face of an uncivilized horror, but the rules had failed them. The system had failed them. That night, she called a meeting of the parents. They gathered in the school library, their faces etched with a new, harder desperation. "We can't wait any more," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that silenced the room. "The police are lost. The media is turning our tragedy into a circus. We are the only ones who can find our children." She unrolled a large, detailed map of Blackwood Forest on the table. It was an old topographical map, one she had found in the town archives. It showed not just the official trails, but the old logging roads, the forgotten hunting paths, the hidden creeks and canyons that the official search parties had overlooked. "Thomas Miller isn't on the trails," she said, her finger tracing a faint, almost invisible line on the map. "He's in the deep woods. The places no one goes anymore. The places he knew as a child." She pointed to a spot in the heart of the forest, a place marked on the old map with a single cryptic word: sanctuary. "This is where we need to look," she said. "This is where he's taken them." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on a hunch and a faded map. But it was more than they had. It was a glimmer of hope in a sea of despair. The parents agreed. They would go themselves. They would defy the police, the media, the world, and venture into the dark heart of the forest. They would become their own search party, their own army. The next morning, as the sun rose over the tormented town of Northwood, a convoy of cars and trucks, filled with determined, heartbroken parents, made its way towards the entrance of Blackwood National Forest. They were armed with flashlights, with supplies, with a fierce, primal love for their lost children. They were a small, civilian army, marching into a war zone. The conflict had escalated from a passive waiting game to an active, dangerous pursuit. The antagonist was no longer just a phantom. He was a destination. The victims were no longer just waiting to be rescued. They were fighting back. And the witness, the town, was left to watch, to hold its breath, to pray for a miracle. The journey into the woods was a descent into a world of primal fear. The forest, once a place of beauty and recreation, was now a labyrinth of shadows and secrets. The parents, led by Sarah and her old map, were no longer just searching for their children. They were hunting a monster in his own lair, and they knew, with a chilling certainty, that the forest would not give up its secrets easily. The closer they got to the truth, the greater the danger became. The real battle had just begun. The air in the deep woods was different. It was thick, heavy, ancient. The light of the morning sun struggled to penetrate the dense canopy of redwoods, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. The sounds of the outside world, the distant traffic, the hum of the town, were gone, replaced by an unnerving silence, broken only by the crunch of their own footsteps on the damp earth. The group of parents, a small, determined band of around 15, moved in a tight formation, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the surrounding wilderness. They had left the official search area far behind, venturing into a part of Blackwood that was wild, untamed, and largely unexplored. They were guided by Sarah's old map, a fragile piece of paper that felt like their only lifeline. The tension was a living thing, a palpable presence that coiled in their stomachs and tightened their chests. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. They were trespassers in a hostile land, and they could feel the weight of the forest's gaze upon them. Mark stayed close to Sarah, his hand never far from her arm. He was a man of logic and reason, a software engineer who lived in a world of code and algorithms. This world, this primal wilderness, was alien to him. But he was here for her, for Leo, his love, a silent, steady presence in the face of their shared terror. They had been hiking for hours, a grueling uphill trek that left them breathless and exhausted. The path Sarah was following was barely a path at all, just a faint indentation in the earth, overgrown with ferns and moss. It was clear that no one had walked this way in a very long time. It was one of the other fathers, a burly construction worker named Dave, who found the first sign. He stopped, holding up a hand for silence. He was pointing to a tree, a massive ancient redwood whose bark was scarred and weathered. "Look," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Carved into the bark of the tree, at about a child's eye level, was a crude drawing. It was the same figure from Leo's nightmare, the same figure from the drawing found on the bus. The whispering man, tall, thin, with a perfectly round, featureless face. A collective gasp went through the group. They were on the right track. He was leading them. Or taunting them. They pressed on, their pace quickening, their exhaustion forgotten. They found more carvings, every few hundred yards, a trail of breadcrumbs left by a monster. The drawings were all the same terrifying figure, a silent sentinel watching their progress. The path began to descend into a narrow rocky canyon. A small creek, its water black and cold, snaked through the bottom of the canyon. The air grew colder, the silence deeper. It felt like they were entering the earth's throat. And then they saw it. Tucked away under a rocky overhang, almost completely hidden by a curtain of ivy, was a small, wooden door. It was old, the wood warped and gray, with a rusty iron handle. It was a door that led into the side of the canyon, a door that shouldn't have been there. A wave of fear and revulsion washed over the group. This was it. The place on the map. Sanctuary. Dave, the construction worker, stepped forward. He put his hand on the iron handle and pulled. The door groaned in protest. The sound of rusted metal scraping against stone. It opened into a dark, narrow tunnel. A wave of cool, musty air, smelling of damp earth, and something else. Something sweet and cloying, washed over them. They hesitated, a wall of fear holding them back. This was the point of no return. To step through that door was to step into the monster's den, to surrender to the unknown. It was Sarah who moved first. Her love for her son was a fire that burned brighter than her fear. She took a flashlight from her backpack, its beam cutting a sharp white line through the darkness, and stepped into the tunnel. Mark was right behind her, his hand on her back. One by one, the other parents followed, a chain of flickering lights. Moving into the belly of the beast, the tunnel was man-made, the walls rough-hewn stone. It sloped gently downwards, leading them deeper and deeper into the earth. The air was thick, hard to breathe. The sweet, cloying smell grew stronger after. About 50 yards, the tunnel opened into a large cavernous room. The beam of their flashlights danced across the walls, revealing a scene of unimaginable horror. The room was a makeshift living space. There was a crude bed in the corner, a table and a chair. But it was the walls that made them gasp, that made them retch. The walls were covered in drawings, hundreds of them, all depicting the same tall, thin figure, the Whispering Man, but these drawings were different from the ones they had seen before. They were more detailed, more disturbing. In some, the Whispering Man was holding the hands of small children, leading them into the woods. In others, he was standing over them as they slept. And in the most terrifying drawings of all, the children's faces were no longer blank ovals. They were filled in with expressions of pure, unadulterated terror. On the table, there was a stack of papers. They were children's drawings. Leo's distinctive, colorful style was unmistakable. He had drawn his family, his house, his dog, but in every picture, in the corner, in the background, was the shadow of the Whispering Man. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. In the center of the room, on a small wooden pedestal, was a tape recorder. An old cassette tape recorder. Next to it was a single unlabeled cassette tape. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the tape recorder. She pressed the play button. The sound that filled the cavern was the sound of a child's voice. A young boy, his voice small and scared. "My name is Thomas Miller. I am 10 years old. He told me not to tell. He said the Whispering Man would be angry. But I have to tell. I have to tell someone." The voice paused, and in the silence, they could hear the sound of another person breathing, a slow, raspy sound. "He comes to my window at night." The boy's voice continued, trembling. "He whispers my name. He says he has a secret for me, a special place in the woods, a sanctuary. He says my parents don't love me. He says he's my real father." A wave of nausea washed over Sarah. The man in the photograph with the young Thomas Miller. The man in the dark suit, the boy's voice began to cry, a sound of pure, helpless terror. "He's taking me there tonight. To the sanctuary. He says I'll be safe there. He says we'll be a family, but I'm scared. I don't want to go. Please someone help me." The tape ended with a click, leaving a silence that was more terrifying than the screams. The conspiracy was suddenly, horrifyingly clear. Thomas Miller wasn't the original monster. He was the first victim. He had been abducted as a child by a man he called the Whispering Man, a predator who had poisoned his mind and stolen his life. And now, 30 years later, Miller was recreating his own abduction, casting himself in the role of the monster, driven by a twisted, desperate need to understand what had happened to him. But who was the original Whispering Man? Who was the man in the photograph? The man who had started it all? Mark, his face pale, picked up a small leather-bound book from the table. It was a diary. The handwriting was neat, precise. It was Thomas Miller's. He opened it to the last entry, dated the day before the field trip. "The circle must be completed," he read, his voice a choked whisper. "The children are ready. They know the story, they trust me. I will take them to the sanctuary, the same way he took me. And this time, he will have to come back for us. He will have to face what he did. He will have to answer for his sins." His name is Arthur Thompson, and he is the principal of Northwood Elementary. The world stopped. The air left the room. The name echoed in the cavern, a death knell. Arthur Thompson. The principal, the man who had feigned concern, who had offered empty reassurances, who had stood before them and lied. The full monstrous scope of the conspiracy was laid bare. Thompson, the original whispering man, had abducted Thomas Miller 30 years ago. He had created a monster, a victim who had been twisted into a mirror image of his own abuser. And now, Miller had taken the children as bait, a desperate, insane plan to lure his tormentor back to the scene of his original crime. The stakes had shifted from a personal tragedy to a public scandal of unimaginable proportions. The enemy was not just a lone crazed kidnapper. It was a pillar of the community, a man who had hidden in plain sight for decades. A wolf in sheep's clothing. The tension in the cavern was unbearable. The parents looked at each other, their faces a mixture of horror, rage, and a new, terrifying understanding. They were not just fighting for their children, they were fighting a legacy of evil that had poisoned their town for a generation. And in that moment, they knew what they had to do. They were not going to wait for the police. They were not going to let the system handle it. They were going to deliver their own justice. Sarah took the tape recorder. Mark took the diary. They were the evidence, the weapons they would use to expose the monster. They emerged from the tunnel. Blinking in the dim light of the canyon, their faces set, their purpose clear. The hunt for Thomas Miller was over. The hunt for Arthur Thompson had just begun. The cinematic payoff was coming, and it would be a storm of righteous fury, a public reckoning that would tear the town of Northwood apart. And in the rubble, they prayed they would find their children. Alive. The drive back from Blackwood Forest was a blur of adrenaline and righteous fury. The parents, once a fractured group of grieving individuals, were now a single cohesive unit, an army with a clear objective. The diary and the cassette tape were their weapons, proof of a conspiracy so monstrous it defied belief. They didn't go to the police. The system had already failed them. Thompson was a respected member of the community, a man with connections, with power. They knew he would deny everything, that he would use his influence to bury the truth, just as he had buried it 30 years ago. No, this required a different kind of justice. A public justice, a trial by fire. The plan was audacious, reckless, and born of pure desperation. The annual Founders' Day picnic was the next day. It was the town's biggest event, a celebration of Northwood's history and community spirit. The entire town would be there. The media would be there. And Arthur Thompson, the man of the hour, would be there, giving his annual speech. It was the perfect stage for a public execution. Sarah became the general. Her grief and fear forged into a steely resolve. She delegated tasks, her voice calm and commanding. Dave, the construction worker, and a few of the other fathers would secure the town square, ensuring that Thompson couldn't escape. Another group would handle the media, feeding them tantalizing hints of a bombshell revelation, ensuring that every camera was pointed at the stage when the moment came. Sarah and Mark's job was the most critical. They would be the ones to confront Thompson, to play the tape, to read from the diary. They would be the voice of the lost children, the avengers of a forgotten boy. The night was sleepless, a long, tense vigil. Sarah held Leo's photograph, his gap-toothed smile a painful reminder of what was at stake. She was no longer just a mother fighting for her son. She was a warrior fighting for justice, for all the children who had been touched by Thompson's evil. The next day, the town square was a sea of smiling faces and festive decorations. The smell of barbecue and popcorn filled the air. It was a scene of idyllic small-town life, a cruel, surreal backdrop to the drama that was about to unfold. Sarah and her army moved through the crowd, their faces grim, their purpose hidden behind forced smiles. They took their positions, a network of silent conspirators waiting for their cue. At noon, Arthur Thompson took the stage. He was the picture of civic pride, his smile wide, his voice resonating with false sincerity. He spoke of community, of tradition, of the bright future of Northwood. He even had the audacity to mention the missing children, to ask for a moment of silence, his face a mask of feigned sorrow. A wave of revulsion washed over Sarah. She could feel the rage building inside her, a white-hot fire dot. As Thompson's speech reached its crescendo, Sarah gave the signal. The fathers moved to block the exits to the stage. The parents in the crowd surged forward, forming a human wall around the town square. The media, sensing a story, pushed to the front, their cameras rolling. And then, Sarah and Mark walked onto the stage. Thompson's smile faltered. He looked at them, his eyes wide with confusion, then a flicker of fear. Sarah, Mark, what is the meaning of this? Sarah didn't answer. She walked to the microphone, her heart pounding, her hands steady. She held up the cassette player. We have something we'd like to share with you. Mr. Thompson, she said, her voice clear and cold, ringing through the stunned silence of the crowd. A voice from the past. She pressed play. The sound of the young Thomas Miller's voice, small and terrified, filled the town square. The festive atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a chilling, horrified silence. The crowd listened, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. As the boy's story unfolded, a 30-year-old secret unearthed in the bright light of day. When the tape ended, a collective gasp went through the crowd. All eyes were on Thompson. His face was ashen, his composure shattered. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting back and forth, searching for an escape that wasn't there. This is a fabrication, he stammered, his voice a weak, desperate croak. A cruel, sick joke. Is it? Mark's voice boomed from the other microphone. He held up the diary. Then perhaps you can explain this. The diary of the man you turned into a monster. The man who is holding our children, waiting for you to come and finish what you started. Mark began to read from the diary, his voice filled with a cold, righteous fury. He read about the sanctuary, about the twisted logic of a broken mind, about the desperate plan to lure the original whispering man back to the scene of his crime. With every word, another layer of Thompson's carefully constructed life was stripped away, revealing the monster beneath. The crowd, the people who had known him for years, who had trusted him with their children, looked at him with a new, terrifying understanding. Their beloved principal, their community leader, was a predator, a child abductor, a monster hiding in plain sight. Thompson, his face a mask of pure terror, made a run for it. He tried to push past Sarah, to escape the stage, but the fathers were there. A wall of angry, determined men. They grabbed him, holding him fast. The crowd erupted. The shock and horror turned to rage, a primal, collective fury. They surged forward, a wave of righteous anger, their voices a deafening roar. Monster, child abuser. Where are our children? The police, who had been standing on the sidelines, were overwhelmed. They formed a protective circle around Thompson, trying to shield him from the mob's fury, but it was no use. The town had become judge, jury, and executioner. In the midst of the chaos, a single piercing siren cut through the air. A police car, not from the local department, but a state trooper's vehicle, screeched to a halt at the edge of the town square. Detective Harding got out of the car. He pushed his way through the crowd, his face grim. He wasn't looking at Thompson, he was looking at Sarah. We found him, he said, his voice low, meant for her ears only. Miller, he called us. He gave himself up. Sarah's heart stopped. The children, she whispered, her voice barely audible. They're safe, Harding said, a flicker of compassion in his tired eyes. All of them, they're shaken, but they're alive. A wave of relief so profound it almost brought her to her knees washed over Sarah. She grabbed Mark, her body shaking with sobs, the tears she had held back for so long finally breaking free. Harding walked onto the stage. He took the microphone from Sarah's hand. His voice, calm and authoritative, silenced the crowd. Arthur Thompson, he said, his voice ringing with the weight of the law. You are under arrest for the abduction of Thomas Miller in 1986. and for conspiracy in the abduction of the 22 children of Northwood Elementary. He snapped a pair of handcuffs on Thompson's wrists. The sound, a sharp, metallic click, was the sweetest sound Sarah had ever heard. It was the sound of justice, the sound of a monster being brought to his knees. The cinematic payoff was complete. The public shaming, the dramatic arrest, the emotional catharsis of a community's rage unleashed. The villain was vanquished, the truth exposed in the most public, most humiliating way possible. As Thompson was led away, his head bowed in shame, the crowd parted, their faces a mixture of relief, anger, and a deep, profound sadness. The celebration was over. The town of Northwood would never be the same. The scars of this day, of this revelation, would run deep. But in that moment, all that mattered was the news that their children were safe. A fleet of school buses, the real heroes of this story, was already on its way to Blackwood Forest to bring them home. Sarah stood on the stage, wrapped in Mark's arms, and watched as the man who had stolen her son's innocence was driven away. The fight was over. The war was won. But the emotional aftermath, the long, slow process of healing, was just beginning. The sun was setting on the town of Northwood, closing a chapter of darkness, and offering the faint, fragile promise of a new dawn. The reunion was a storm of tears and embraces, a chaotic, beautiful symphony of relief. The school parking lot, once a site of agonizing vigil, was now a scene of unadulterated joy. The yellow buses, this time arriving right on schedule, were greeted with a roar of applause and choked sobs. When Sarah saw Leo, her heart felt like it would burst. He ran into her arms, his small body trembling, and she held him so tightly she thought she might never let go. He was thinner, his face pale, his eyes holding a shadow of the horror he had endured, but he was alive. He was home. The days that followed were a blur of therapy sessions, police interviews, and quiet, tearful conversations. The children were traumatized, their innocence shattered, but they were resilient. They had survived. Thomas Miller, the man who had been both victim and villain, had led the police to the children. He had kept them in a hidden underground bunker, a place he called the real sanctuary, a place he had built years ago, a refuge from the world that had hurt him. He had cared for them, fed them, told them stories. He had been their captor, but in a strange, twisted way, he had also been their protector. His confession, a long rambling account of a life stolen, was a tragedy in its own right. He had never recovered from his own abduction. The whispering man had become a part of him, a dark passenger he could never escape. His plan, as insane as it was, had been a desperate cry for help, a way to force the world to finally see the monster who had created him. Arthur Thompson, the pillar of the community, was exposed as a serial predator. The investigation into his past unearthed a string of similar incidents of children who had been manipulated, abused, and silenced. His trial was a media sensation, a sordid spectacle that laid bare the dark underbelly of their seemingly perfect town. He was found guilty on all counts, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The town of Northwood was left to grapple with the emotional wreckage. The Founders' Day picnic became a symbol of their collective shame, a reminder of the monster they had harbored in their midst. The school was renamed, the old name tainted by the association with Thompson. Life would never return to normal. The parents of the lost children were forever changed, bound by a shared trauma that no one else could understand. They had seen the darkness, had fought the monster, and had emerged victorious, but not unscathed. Sarah found her own form of healing in advocacy. She started a foundation, a support network for families of missing children, a way to turn her pain into purpose. She became a voice for the voiceless, a warrior for the innocent. A year after the abduction, the town gathered to dedicate a memorial in the town square. It was a simple, elegant fountain, a symbol of life and renewal. On a bronze plaque were the names of the 22 children who had been taken, and the name of one other, Thomas Miller. It was a controversial decision, but Sarah had fought for it. He was not a hero, but he was not just a monster either. He was a victim, a casualty of a crime that had been ignored for too long. His name on the memorial was a reminder of the cost of silence, of the price of forgetting. Sarah stood by the fountain with Leo, his hand in hers. He was smiling again, the gap in his teeth a little wider, the galaxy of freckles on his face a little brighter. The shadow in his eyes was still there, a faint, lingering echo of the darkness he had seen. But it was receding, replaced by the light of a childhood reclaimed. He looked at the plaque, his finger tracing the letters of Thomas Miller's name. He was sad, Leo said, his voice quiet, thoughtful. He just wanted his dad to find him. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. In the simple, profound wisdom of a child, Leo had understood the heart of the tragedy. It was a story about a lost boy, a boy who had waited a lifetime to be found. She squeezed his hand, a silent promise to never let him go. The emotional echo of their ordeal would always be with them, a haunting reminder of the fragility of life, of the darkness that can hide in the most unexpected places. But it was also a reminder of the power of love, of the strength of a community, of the fierce, unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. The fountain bubbled, its gentle sound a soothing balm on the town's wounded soul. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of hope and healing. The story of the lost children of Northwood had come to an end, but its legacy, a story of loss and redemption, of horror and hope, would be whispered in the heart of the town. Forever, a cautionary tale, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The silence of the forest had been broken, and in its place was a new sound, the sound of healing, of remembrance, of a future rebuilt from the ashes of a tragic past.